Damien, I want to ask you about the first conversations that you had with Ryan about this project because it actually predated La La Land. You had a chance to read James Hanson's biography of Neil Armstrong. What did you see as your path into it, and what were the earliest conversations that you had with Ryan and then with Josh about the story inside a very big book that you thought was the most interesting one to tell?
I think the first thing, it started, so the producers of the film, Wick Godfrey, Marty Bowen, and Isaac Klausner, I had just finished Whiplash and been at Sundance with it and was back in LA, and they kind of, essentially they just asked me if I was interested in Neil Armstrong. And I said no, and they gave me Jim Henson's book that the movie's based on, and I don't know. I think it must have sat there for a while. I remember they gave me some DVDs of archival material as well, and just kind of left me with it. And for whatever reason, at some point, weeks later, I opened up the book, read a little bit, popped in one of the DVDs, watched a little bit of the material, the archival material, and something just sort of that I guess I hadn't thought about the space race before, just sort of grabbed me. It suddenly seemed, especially in Jim's book, more dangerous, more radical, more unlikely, more even at times reckless, more at times heroic than I had. Than I guess I had given it credit for in the past. I think I subscribed to the sort of rosy idea of NASA growing up as, certainly NASA in the 60s, as being this sort of unending string of successes, maybe a couple of issues here and there, but just in general, just kind of a sort of super heroic kind of group of people doing super heroic things, almost as though they were easy. And what Jim's book really sort of, and what Jim's research into Neil specifically really details is that for Neil and for everyone around him, this was incredibly hard. Which should be obvious, but in a way it was kind of successfully hidden from the country. And so I just became fascinated by that, by this sort of the unmasking, stripping away the mythology and kind of looking at the sort of messier reality underneath. And that's what I kind of first described to Josh, and Josh started working on the script, and I described to Ryan, before we shot La La Land, this was the first thing we kind of met about to talk about.
Josh, when you're thinking about your approach to this material, in some ways it reminds me about your work on Spotlight, that you're really interested in the nuts and bolts, shoe leather aspect of the work. That in Spotlight is about how journalists went about putting together a story, and in First Man, it's really about the day-to-day work that goes into something like this. Was that something that you found narratively interesting, that the more you talked about the work as opposed to the heroism of the work, it became a more personal story for you?
Yeah, I mean, like Damien, I was, when Damien first pitched this to me, I was very interested in Damien because I had watched Whiplash and was blown away, like I think a lot of folks were. But I didn't know much about Neil. And as Damien said, I was just knocked. I mean, you guys have just seen he lost two of his closest colleagues within 12 months. And after the first of them died, Elliot C., he had to go up in Gemini 8, and he almost died. Just the sequence of tragedies and losses and failures and the way they piled up. There's a great statement, engineering is the obviation of failure, right? Which to me is, in some ways, sums up the movie. And so I just got really sort of taken by those details. I will say, it was such a provocative portrait of the space race and of Neil in particular, so different from all the portraits that have come before, that we really felt a need to be accurate in some detail, which was totally mind-numbing at times, especially with the technical stuff. But we felt like we had to get it right in order to help make sure our thesis was clear.
Justin, you have a long relationship with Damien. When you're thinking about music for this film, there's a little dance number you play, there's a little waltz during the Gemini docking, which seems like a little salute to La La Land. But thematically, what were the kinds of things you were working toward, and how did you end up orchestrating a theremin into a lot of the score?
Yeah, so we start with melody. We just at the very beginning, I just work at a piano and send piano demo after piano demo to Damien until we kind of lock in on the right theme or themes. So there were certain words we just talked about at the beginning, like grief, pain, loneliness, a sort of cosmic pain, a sort of pain that could sort of transcend, the earth-bound story and carry us all the way to some of those space scenes. It could be used in a very grounded way at the beginning of the story, but then it could sort of be orchestrated later on to be big and grand, something that could work on the harp at the very beginning with the family and with Karen, but then also work in those action scenes, work in the landing, in a sort of grand way, but still, even when it's been used in its biggest, most action-packed form, it still is infused with that same pain that's been, motivating or underline the whole Neil's whole journey to that point. So I was looking for that melody. What could that melody be? And we found that after a couple months, and then started talking about sounds and how to orchestrate it. And something Damien talked about from the beginning is we wanted it to sound kind of have some otherworldly tones to it, to have an orchestra, but to mix some things into the orchestra that would make it just a little different. So that's where the theremin idea came from. Damien mentioned the theremin, so I got one and started messing around and learning how to play it. And I think my technique would probably appall a real theremin player. You're supposed to have, these very sort of fine hand positions. I just wave my whole hand at it. But I learned to do the melody for this and started figuring out how to mix it in, how to lay it into the orchestra and have it sit so it could sort of give a little bit of that otherworldly quality without it being overly, we didn't want it to be overly cute or sci-fi. So finding that the arrangements where it could sit in the orchestra, that was another one of our challenges. Yeah.
Ai-Ling, I want to ask you about the opening scene and your use of sound in it, because there's so many elements. There's Neil's breathing, or Ryan's breathing. There's rattles, there's communication, there's instruments, there's engines, and there's silence. When you're thinking about what you're trying to create, because there's no dialogue in that opening sequence, how are you building sound to tell story, and why was silence so important there and at other places in the film?
Well, much earlier on, basically, in these cockpit sequences, I had an early conversation with Damien. He wanted the sound to be really like immersive and tactile at the same time, and space travel to have this like chilling quality. So for the opening in the X-15, we introduced like rocket sounds that we had recorded during production and pre-production time, and also, with the image, and we are always inside the cockpit with Neil from his perspective. So to create that really, intense, visceral turbulence. So we also recorded some motion simulator rides when the machine injects low frequencies to like heavily shake and vibrate the entire vehicle, just so it has this tight space. And we have to constantly build an intensity and to make it feel dangerous. So besides playing some of the authentic sounds wherever we can, including a sonic boom when the X-15 goes past the atmosphere, which we recorded from a SpaceX Falcon Heavy recording. Damien wanted to for us to go into this more of an emotional journey for Neil on how he felt, and so we had to go into something more surreal or surprising. We kind of thought maybe let's try introducing some animal vocals on his way up into the Earth's atmosphere. So we start introducing elephant roars, lion growls, animal stampede. They'll just build up to the point where Neil couldn't he reached the point and he flipped the switch. And these scenes are important for the sound to give it a sense of unease and surprise. So in the mix we played with dynamics.
Claire, there's not a lot. Neil was not somebody who talked a lot about his personal life. A lot of people he worked with didn't know that he had a daughter, and very few people knew that he had a daughter who died. When you're thinking about what you know about his marriage and what you know about Janet, how much can you get from relatives, from family members, and where did you find your way in terms of getting an understanding of what she was like and what her marriage was like?
Well, that's the thing. They were very private people, not just in a kind of public sense, but with their friends and family as well. I think our main resources, I think, especially for me anyway, were Rick and Mark with their children. And children don't really know a lot about their parents' married life, really, it seems. You sort of don't want to know all that stuff. So a lot of it is kind of piecing things together, understanding what these two people are like as individuals, and then, doing the work which, we're required to do, which is trying to understand what they feel in those situations and things. But Jan, I found there were so many people who wanted to share memories of her and talk about her. She was a very, very impressive woman. And that can be slightly daunting when everybody you talk to has sort of incredible memories of this really capable, amazing woman. But yeah, the more I learned about her, the more I was amazed by how she held it all together for as long as she did, really.
Ryan James Hansen, who wrote the biography of Neil Armstrong, said that when asked how the landing changed Neil Armstrong, he said, "I couldn't think of a person who was changed less by it." And I think that says a lot about Neil Armstrong, that for him, the mission was more important than what it meant to him. And when you were thinking about playing a private person and somebody who was uncomfortable in many ways with the acclaim and that he received, what was your path in, and what were your earliest conversation with Josh and Damien about what you felt were important about capturing the essence of a person who is very hard to pinpoint?
Well, I've never had more help on a film in my life, which is a testament to Neil and Janet. Everybody who knew them wanted to help us. They wanted to give us any anecdote or small piece of information or interaction that they had. Even when I went to NASA, people who had only had Neil pass by them would want to tell me how he looked at them or the way that he regarded them. It was I felt this overwhelming amount of support, and certainly from their sons, which I think was the most difficult part of the film, was knowing that they were going to see this film, and they weren't going to see a film about historical figures. They were going to see a film about their mom and dad. And Neil's sister June, she met us at the in the room Neil was born, at the farm that he was raised, and she even embodied Neil for me in the living room, and she did her impersonation of him for me. With the love that a sister has for her brother, it was really so beautiful. So yes, Neil was very private. A lot of people felt as though he was very remote. He was many different things at different points in his life. If you look at him in the USO tours with Bob Hope, after the missions, he's very funny and a very different person. But that was in there. It's just we're seeing him at a very specific time in his life, and we start with this loss that is, I think, for me, unimaginable. I'm not sure how anyone ever deals with that, and I really just, my heart broke for Neil and Janet, and to be then thrust into the spotlight and handed this responsibility of putting a human being on the moon, whilst trying to deal with that, and to deal with it with the grace and the elegance and the fierce sense of privacy and that they handled it. It's just, I really fell in love with them. I really admired them. It was very hard to find out things about them, and that made me respect them even more. So there was not one specific avenue to accessing him. It really was every little bit of information from all the people along the way that wanted to help, that helped to add some color and texture to a couple that I felt was really deserving of this tribute that the film was trying to pay to them.
Thank you for bringing your film with us.